Not everyone around the world celebrated the return after 2 grueling years of the Israeli hostages held captive by Hamas today. While Britain's news media led its coverage with footage of the Israelis reuniting with their families, The Guardian splashed celebratory images from Palestine to its readers instead, with prisoners seen jubilantly returning after being freed by Israel in order to recover the hostages held by Hamas. It led with the headline, "Locked up for 24 years, joy and sorrow as Palestinian prisoners and detainees return home." The Guardian referred to the prisoners as having been seized from Gaza rather than arrested. Among those returning home was a Palestinian who had raped and murdered a 13-year-old Israeli girl. Also among the released were Rayed Sheikh, who took part in the lynching of Vadim Norzic and Yossi Avrahami at a police station in 2000. The 2 men were murdered in a Palestinian police station by a mob who then paraded their dead bodies through the street. The Guardian in its coverage said these men exiting a bus to a joyous crowd on arrival in Ramallah were gaunt, the sharp angles of their faces decorated by freshly scabbed over wounds. Through its coverage, The Guardian made continued reference to prisoners not eating much or being thin, cheekbones jutting out, men bearing the marks of recent beatings, though Israel maintains its prisons comply with international law. Curiously, The Guardian broke with its UK, Australian and international editions, who focused on the jubilant return of Palestinian prisoners, when it came to its US edition. For Donald Trump's country, where support for Israel runs deep, the left-wing paper chose to splash footage of Israeli hostages returning home, with the headline, "All living Israeli hostages freed as Trump arrives in Egypt for summit." Britain has been heavily divided over the Israel-Gaza war, which saw the BBC and Channel 4 accused of parroting Hamas propaganda. Colonel Richard Kemp says Britain has fallen short in supporting its ally, as antisemitism has been allowed to permeate.
World leaders gather at the Gaza Peace Summit in Israel, in Egypt, as President Donald Trump says that talks have started for the second phase of the Gaza peace plan. Let's join now my next guest. That's a former British Army officer, Colonel Richard Kemp. Colonel Kemp, always a pleasure to have your company. You and I have spoken since the very, very beginning of the war in Gaza, and one of the huge fears that you had all along was that unless the job was properly done, Gaza could simply melt into the civilian population and perhaps return in future to try and take over again. Are you scared that that could happen now, or do you think that the job could be done and Hamas can be wiped out?
I think there's every likelihood Hamas will try and fight on. They're not going to melt away. They will do their best to retain their weapons, maybe even by rebranding themselves, as we've begun to see. And we've seen them murdering in large numbers some of their opponents in Gaza already. So that's where the next real stage of the Trump plan comes into play, the extent to which there is going to be actual concrete efforts to disarm Hamas and to demilitarize Gaza. And how that happens, how that works, we will just have to wait and see. But one thing I think we can be sure of is, meanwhile, the IDF will be watching very carefully what happens in Gaza, and will have to be ready to react and intervene again should the threat raise its head again. I don't think Israel can afford to make the same mistakes as it made before the 7th of October in 2023.
Colonel Kemp, may I ask you about what appears to be an emerging issue, a thorny topic, and that is the bodies of the deceased hostages. Earlier on today, we were told that they would be released, 28 of them in full. Now we understand only 2 of them are in Red Cross vehicles on their way back to Tel Aviv. And the Hostages and Missing Persons Forum, of course, the families of those deceased, are saying already this is a catastrophe, and there should be an immediate suspension of all agreements with Hamas. They've betrayed their side of the bargain already. Should Israel cease releasing any prisoners?
I think Israel should certainly verify why this situation has come about. And without a doubt, Israel should cease releasing any further Gazan prisoners until Hamas's side of the deal has been met. And then, of course, if necessary, Israel should be ready to go back to the fight, because this is an integral part of the deal. It may sound less important to the likes of you and me, but certainly for Israelis, the release of all of the remaining 28 hostages who are not alive, it's critically important. And I've heard tonight that some family members and some of the supporters for the hostages in Israel are saying Israel should go back into the fight if they're not released. So I think it's really important this happens. And as I say, Israel needs to verify exactly why this is not happening. And one thing that I would always have in the forefront of my mind in this kind of situation is that whatever Hamas says, you can't believe it. This is as we all know, this is a vicious terrorist organization that has no honor. That whatever their word is, you cannot consider it to be true. So I think, we'll just have to wait and see how this unfolds.
Could I ask you how you believe the United Kingdom stands now as we approach this next phase? A lot of people have been critical of Britain's performance, the recognition of the state of Palestine. Keir Starmer wasn't name-checked at that peace in the Middle East, signing a few moments ago. The leaders of Azerbaijan, Turkey, Italy, a lot of them got a mention. Keir Starmer, do you think he's played his hand wrong? Do you think Britain will look back and we can ask questions about perhaps did Britain back the wrong side in this conflict, Colonel Kemp?
I think Britain has behaved disgracefully under this government. First of all, in its decision to put an arms embargo on Israel. Secondly, its threat to arrest Prime Minister Netanyahu if he comes to England. And thirdly, by probably the worst of all the actions was to recognise a non-existent Palestinian state in order to appease the anti-Israel elements of its electorate in the UK without any regard for world peace or for the supporting and a really important ally in Israel. So I think we've behaved very badly over this. If anything, our actions of encouraging Hamas, and don't forget, Hamas were among the strongest people praising Starmer and Macron for recognising a Palestinian state. We've had the opposite effect to the effect Trump's had. Trump has achieved almost the impossible by bringing this peace agreement about. And Britain almost did whatever it could to frustrate that by recognising the Palestinian state. And the problem is, for the future, looking forward, is that Hamas had two major assets. One was the hostages. The living ones now released, the dead ones hopefully released soon. The second asset that Hamas had was Western opinion and Western support, Western appeasement. And this whole program will not go ahead effectively unless the West actually becomes far more robust and far more supportive against Hamas. Because disarming Hamas, demilitarizing Gaza, the West has a role to play in that. But the West must completely change tack to make it as tough as possible for Hamas to continue to exist.
Colonel Kemp, as well as that lasting legacy perhaps of betrayal across the Middle East in the eyes of Israel, certainly amongst the United Kingdom's reputational damage, I want to ask you about something you've spoken a lot about as well, and that is the seismic ripples that have come to our own shores. Now, the emboldenment of protesters, the emboldenment of a rising wave of anti-Semitism in the United Kingdom as perhaps a fragile peace settles across the Middle East. Do you think we'll find peace on our own streets? Or if those radicals become so emboldened, the next problem is now on British soil?
I'm certain we won't find peace on our own streets. Unfortunately, I'm sorry to say that, but I think it's true. Clearly, if Hamas is got rid of, one way or the other, as long as there's no further appeasement of Hamas, and if Hamas is disarmed, if it is, and I'm not 100% confident it will be, but if it is, then that will be a big disincentive towards jihadists globally. If they're seen to succeed and are seen to be able to proclaim any kind of victory, that will embolden jihadists everywhere, including in the UK. And that's another reason why it's so important that our government plays its role in standing up against Hamas. If they fail to do that, which I suspect they will, because they, as I mentioned before, domestic politics is more important to them, appeasing their anti-Israel mobs who've flooded onto the streets week after week in the last 2 years. And they're afraid of them. And if they don't stand up to them, then, it's like anything. Appeasement is seen as provocation, and they will just go from strength to strength. I have no doubt whatever about that.